Shana Tova, everyone. Happy New Year. And welcome to our Yom Kippur afternoon conversation with Yossi Klein Halevi. Yossi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Together with Imam Abdullah and Tepli of Duke University, he co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative. Yossi is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, and co-host with Daniel Hartman of the Institute's award-winning podcast, For Heaven's Sake. He's also the author of Like Dreamers, the story of the Israeli paratroopers who reunited Jerusalem and divided a nation, which won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year Award. Other books by Yossi include At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden, a Jew's search for God with Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land, published in 2001. His first book, Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, told the story of his teenage attraction to and subsequent disillusion with Jewish militancy. Yossi writes for the op-ed pages of leading American newspapers. He is a former contributing editor of the New Republic. Yossi was born in New York. He has a BA in Jewish Studies from Brooklyn College and a master's in journalism from Northwestern University. He moved to Israel in 1982 and lives in Jerusalem with his wife, Sarah, who is an astrologer, and they have 3 children. Finally, Yossi is a personal friend, and it is my great honor to welcome him on this Yom Kippur day to Anshe Emet. Welcome, Yossi Klein Halevi.
And I'm really honored to be with you, and Shana Tova, everyone. And I even wore a shirt for the occasion.
I take note of that. Very dressed up.
Very dressed up.
I want to wish you a Gemar Chatima Tova, and that all of us should be inscribed for a year of good. The hostages should come home, and God willing, a year of peace as well. But let's turn to the issues at hand. During these difficult days since October 7th, there are certain voices that I and many others have listened for, and yours is certainly high on that list, Yossi. I know that your words will always be well considered and come from a place of deep love for the land of Israel and its meaning and purpose, but also from a very Jewish place of deep moral integrity. I'm so grateful for this time together. So let's get started. In 2018, you published Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. The Israel that you were representing at the time seems like a world away. You began the book this way. Dear neighbor, I call you neighbor because I don't know your name or anything personal about you. Given our circumstances, neighbor may be too casual a word to describe our relationship. We are intruders in each other's dreams, violators of each other's sense of home. We are living incarnations of each other's worst historical nightmares. Neighbors? But I don't know how else to address you. I once believed that we would actually meet, and I'm writing to you with the hope that we still might. I imagine you in your house somewhere on the next hill just beyond my porch. We don't know each other, but our lives are intertwined. I'm wondering, how do these words sound to you as we now go beyond 700 days since October 7th? And would you start the book differently if you were writing it today?
Unbearably sad, Michael. If I would write the book at all today, I would certainly start it differently. And I say if I would write the book, not because there's anything there that I repudiate. There isn't. I stand by the book. I'm glad the book is out. And I know it's been useful, especially for kids on campuses. And the book has had a revival actually since October 7th on campuses. And so I'm very grateful that the book exists. When I say that I don't know if I would be able to write it, I don't mean ideologically, but emotionally, psychologically. Uh, the book required a um, a suspension, a certain suspension of reality, a certain suspension of wariness that all of us who live this conflict have carry with us even before October 7th. But since October 7th, I don't know that I would have the generosity of spirit
Mm.
to reach out to my neighbor. And the book is really premised on the notion that I'm going to tell you my people's story. I need to tell you why I'm living on this hill across the way from your hill, but I'm also inviting you to tell me your narrative. And today, I don't think that we're in any need of hearing more of the Palestinian narrative.
Mm.
If anything, our narrative is being drowned out. And um, and so and you know, I ended the book, the 2019 paperback edition, with letters that I had received in response from Palestinians. And that was a very hard decision, Michael, because I had to decide, should I give the Palestinian counter narrative the last word in this book? I wrote the book to explain Zionism, but I decided to give my respondents the last word. And I don't think I could do that today. I don't think
Mm.
I could leave the reader with the Palestinian narrative. So much has changed.
Too much has changed. You struggled with the word neighbor. You've actually moved from the home that you were writing from then, which really overlooked from French Hill the security wall and those villages.
The West Bank. The West Bank began outside my window.
And you struggle with the word neighbor. What word would you choose today?
I think I still would use the word neighbor. The responses that I received, the positive responses, and there were many more positive responses than I expected.
Mm.
And the most touching responses, and some of them are included in this epilogue, letters from Palestinians to their Israeli neighbor, wrote how moved they were to be addressed by an Israeli as neighbor.
Mm.
And that really made me sad, if you think about it, because we take a relationship with neighbors for granted. And it says something about how we've mistreated the Palestinians all these years in the sense of ignoring their basic dignity. And 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 the fact that Palestinian respondents felt that I was acknowledging their humanity, their dignity, simply by addressing them as neighbor. So I think I would keep that with an explanation, and that we're not only usurpers in each other's dreams, as you read from that opening, but we're now neighbors who look out at each other with dread, with loathing, and the the emotional accounting that we've been doing for 100 years of conflict has just gone into hyperdrive.
Mhm.
And so somehow I would need to find language for that.
Yes. Well, let's move forward to today. The world has been quite busy declaring a Palestinian state. How do you understand this action? What actual implications do you think these declarations will have? And how serious do you believe the government's annexation plan is?
Hard to know which reaction is worse. recognizing a Palestinian state after October 7th and immeasurably empowering Hamas, first of all, within Palestinian society, just when this war has driven home the message to Palestinians, the price of October 7th. Along comes Europe and Canada and Australia and says, no, 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 not so fast. Hamas really uh, is a crucial player here, and it doesn't matter that they'll declare, as Starmer and other leaders have, that Macron, that we're not recognizing Hamas. This is where this is intended to undermine Hamas. Everyone in the Middle East understands that this is a victory for Hamas. So that's on the one hand. On our side, to annex parts of the West Bank and definitively declare the end of a two-state possibility means that we are now vulnerable to all of the accusations that our enemies have been raising for years.
Mm.
And what we always were able to say in response to the accusations of apartheid, for example, was, well, yes, there needs to be two separate laws for Israel and the West Bank, because the moment we apply Israeli law to the West Bank, we've effectively annexed it, and that's the end of the possibility of a two-state solution. So if this Netanyahu government is going to crown its disasters with what for me is really the final disaster, that's going to be a very serious blow. And I don't know how we overcome this moment of each player, the Europeans on the one hand and this government on the other, making every mistake possible. How do we dig ourselves out from those diplomatic ruins?
Right. It feels like the rule of holes. That
Yes.
first rule of holes, you have to kind of stop digging at one point, and it feels like both sides are digging in a way to declare victory on some level.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I have supported this war for most of the duration. I believe now we need to end it and cut our losses. I don't think that the Iranian-Israeli war, which began on October 7th, will be decided in Gaza. It will be decided in Tehran, and that war is by no means over. And we have had extraordinary military victories over this last year. And every day that we dig ourselves deeper in Gaza City, we're undermining that victory. And so it's a combination of disastrous military mistakes, which the IDF senior command is against. We know they're against this. And they've told the government, don't do this. So you combine this undermining of our military achievements with this disastrous diplomatic move, this political move of annexation, and it's a perfect own goal.
But what do you say to people that argue that Israel hasn't finished a war since 1973, that when the United States fought the Second World War, which was the last war that the United
Right.
States actually won, Dresden was in ruins, Hiroshima was in ruins, but the forces that created the war, the moral issues had been dealt with, and no one raised a moral question in those years. A few years later, yes. So how do you respond to that argument?
Look, I was making a similar argument for much of the last 2 years. And the reason that I don't anymore is because circumstances have changed in the sense that the world almost entirely has turned overwhelmingly against Israel. I would say in some ways viciously against Israel, to the point where it's erasing Hamas as a player and it's just Israel, as if we've declared war against civilian Gaza. But you need to look at reality.
Hmm.
And Israel, Israel versus Gaza is not the Allies versus Nazi Germany, not because Hamas doesn't deserve the comparison, but because we're not the Allies. We are one small country increasingly against the rest of the world. In World War II, most of the world was against Nazi Germany. And yes, I look at the ruins of Gaza, and I think from a when you look at the context of the kind of enemy we're fighting, the conditions that the IDF is fighting under, I don't think any army has had to face those kinds of brutal circumstances that we do, with hundreds of kilometers of tunnels and hostages being held now not just for ransom but actually as bait, as a shield, as a human shield. They're not just using their own civilians as shields, now they're using our civilians. So all of these circumstances point to an unprecedentedly brutal battleground. So I don't fault us for the ruins of Gaza. But what I'm saying, from a first of all, from a practical point of view, you need to cut your losses. And also, frankly, I have increasing moral anxiety about what this longest war in our history is doing to the IDF. If we haven't defeated Hamas after 2 years, then it's time to figure out an alternative. And the final argument here is that the government has no morning after plan, or whatever morning after plan we've heard from government ministers is a nightmare. It's essentially emptying Gaza of Palestinians, which is a war crime that this government is seemingly preparing the way to implicate all of us in a war crime. Now, I do not emphatically do not call the war until this point a war crime. This is still a necessary war of defense that needs to wind down on this particular front, so that we will be freed, so that we'll have whatever moral capital we have left
Mm.
against Iran. And 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 so it's a very complicated moral ledger. And I think we need to really um, keep I would say we need to have two um, two goalposts here, or two limitations on ourselves when we think about the moral implications of this war. On the one hand, even if we are fighting an existential war against an enemy that has no moral limits, we, the Jewish state, are forbidden to cross certain moral red lines. That's one goalpost. The other limit is that, given the fact that we are fighting an existential war on multiple fronts against an enemy with no moral limits, there are limits to how much moral responsibility and angst the Jewish people should take on. So these are the for me the two guidelines when
Hmm.
we approach the wrenching moral complexity of this war.
You wrote about this recently in the Times of Israel, and I'm going to again quote you to yourself. You wrote that to be an ambivalent Jew today is not to be uncertain so much as torn between conflicting certainties. On the one hand, the clear and present danger of Iran's religiously motivated obligation to destroy Israel, to return the good name of Islam, and the impact of this war on not only Israel's reputation in the world and the fact that we are no longer innocent. So I think you've talked a little bit about the ambivalence. And how do you understand this idea of Tselem Elohim in the world in which we live in?
What upsets me most about the discourse in Israel and in certain circles in the diaspora is is the line that there are no innocents in Gaza. And I think about Avraham Avinu, our father Abraham, in his argument with God about saving Sodom. There are no innocents in Gaza,
Mm.
hundreds of thousands of children. And and when I say this to certain people on the right, they'll say, well, they grow up to be terrorists and Hamas supporters. And my response is, that's exactly what Palestinians who justify terrorism say, that there are no innocent Israelis. Even children will grow up to be occupying soldiers. And that is when you deal with people only as a collective and you take the worst aspects of their collective identity and impose it on an entire people, you are erasing the image of God.
Mm.
And yes, we do function as collectives, certainly in the Middle East, but we're not only collectives, we're also individuals. And don't erase my individuality by only turning me into a Jew or an Israeli or a Palestinian. I am those things. And I'm proud of those collective identities. I carry them. But if that's all I am, then you are erasing my image of God.
That's all true, and I couldn't agree with you more, but Hamas is very good at reminding Israelis that given the opportunity, they will repeat October 7th again and again and again. When the other side of this argument argues, well, are there really innocents? How do we? It's really trying to find the balance there that is the great challenge that I think you laid out beautifully.
Okay, so look, one of the deep disagreements that we Israelis have with much of the international community is this ludicrous distinction that is made between military Hamas and political Hamas. There is no distinction. So for me, Hamas is Hamas is Hamas. And that means that I am treating anyone who is part of the Hamas network as a legitimate target. And that includes, by the way, fake journalists who are working hand in hand with Hamas. We know that there are dissidents in Gaza that were turned over to Hamas by so-called Palestinian journalists who are
Hmm.
actually working for the Hamas security system. So will I treat them as innocents? No. For me, they're combatants. And that's part of the disconnect that we have with much of the international community. And if a director of a hospital is working hand in hand with Hamas, that part of the hospital is a military base, and is that director a civilian or a combatant? These are the agonizing dilemmas of this war. And I appreciate the fact that you can come back and say, well, is this director of the hospital being coerced? And it's a fair question. But let's not turn this into a black and white issue.
When you spoke about the fact that we are no longer innocent, what did you mean by that?
In 1945, the overwhelming majority of the Jewish people made a decision to embrace Zionism to one extent or another, to be either Zionist or pro-Zionist, as many in the American Jewish community at the time preferred. Uh, Nevertheless, the pre-Holocaust debate over Zionism ended in 1945. And you see it very starkly in the displaced persons camps, which were the first post-Holocaust societies that were created. And I'm working on a book about the post-Holocaust era, and the book begins in the displaced persons camps. And these camps have actually been displaced from our collective memories, and they're an extraordinary story. And what that story shows most of all is the end of the debate on Zionism. Even the ultra-Orthodox who were in the displaced camps became pro-Zionist, most of them. The Bundists, the radical socialist Yiddishist Bund, which before the Holocaust was bitterly anti-Zionist, the remnants of that movement became supporters of the political agenda of Zionism. And you see it very clearly in the relationship between what remains of the Bund with the mainstream Zionist communities. And the moment that the Jewish people adopted Zionism, we made the decision not to be pure anymore. Mm. When you are victims, you're pure and you're completely innocent. The moment you assume power, especially in an existential conflict, a brutal conflict, especially with the kind of enemies we're facing, you have willingly given up your innocence. I think that is one of the greatest decisions that the Jewish people made in 4,000 years of our history. So I celebrate that decision. In this war, we are coming face to face with the brutal consequences, the dark side of that, the unavoidable dark side of that decision. And so, in the best of circumstances, if we are living up to the highest moral standards that we imposed on ourselves, we're no longer innocent. We're no longer pure. Now, there are those, especially in the diaspora, and we see more and more of those, we hear more and more of those voices, who long for the purity and innocence of the pre-state, the pre-transition to power. Now, I grew up in a Holocaust survivor home. I have no nostalgia whatsoever for the purity of innocence. And so that's my starting point. When I say that we have lost our innocence, what I mean is we have no right anymore, nor should we want to assume the identity of victim. Now, in the post-October 7th reality, this is a very complicated psychological place for many Jews, because October 7th was a relapse into victimhood. We were victims on October 7th, but we were victims for one day. On October 8th, virtually the entirety of the people of Israel, the Jewish population of Israel, made a decision, which is we are not going to stay in that condition. We are going to take the war to the other side, and they will now win the competition over victimhood. We made that decision. And we all knew on October 8th what a war in Gaza, a total war in Gaza would look like. And we knew that because we all know Gaza. Anyone who has served in the army in the last 30, 40 years knows Gaza. And we knew we served there, our kids served there. We knew what this war was going to be like. And almost all of us signed on to it, even Yuval Noah Harari. Right. He wrote a piece right after October 7th saying we have no choice. We have to bring Hamas down. He feels differently today, and I understand that. But on October 8th, we made a decision with our eyes wide open. And so you can be right, but you can't be a victim. Not when you have this level of power, not when you have the power to turn Gaza into Berlin 1945. We have no right to claim victimhood. And as a result of that, we're in a kind of psychologically, we're nowhere. Because, and look at this crazy loop that we're in, Michael. On the one hand, our enemies are saying we're Nazi Germany. And on the other hand, we're saying, no, we're the Jews of the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. And if I could just say one more thing about this, because it really sits on me. Mm-hmm. the I'm very uncomfortable with the way we describe October 7th as the largest number of Jews killed since the Holocaust. For me, the context is not what happened there. It's not a pogrom. It's here. It's the largest number of Jews, and not just Jews, by the way, Israelis, because there were a small number of Arab Israelis who were also murdered on October 7th. The largest number of Israelis killed in 100 years of conflict. Now, I don't need anything more to emphasize the enormity of that event. I don't need the Holocaust. And the truth is, when we say never again today, what I think Israelis mean now is never again October 7th. We're not even thinking about the Holocaust anymore. Never again will we be caught unawares. Will we allow our guard to be lowered? Never again. Never again October 7th. And so we need a new language to describe the strange condition we're in, where on the one hand, we are October 7th reawakened our awareness of our vulnerability in Israel and certainly in the diaspora. But it did not restore us to the condition of victim.
I recently heard Chaviv Retek Gur speak about narratives, and he made an interesting point that ties into what you were saying a moment ago. We need to take into account that the entire landscape of the Middle East has changed since October 7th. And his argument was that we need to write, the government can no longer speak about victimhood, but needs to write a new narrative as to who we are as a people with power, and also the strongest military in that part of the world, and one of the strongest in the world itself.
Look at this moment of possibility, and think of the Abraham Accords and the Saudis looking for a way to join, looking for a pretext. And they're telling us all you need to do is, well, first of all, you need to stop this war, come up with a credible political alternative to Hamas that will then allow the Arab world to physically enter Gaza and prevent the return of Hamas. Ultimately, we can't do it, only they can. And then we need one more thing from you. We need you to say that the long-term goal remains a two-state solution. Now, in the past, Netanyahu would have no problem paying lip service to a two-state solution. He did. He already did. But he has now tied himself to the most extreme elements in Israeli society, the far right. And they've placed a veto power effectively on the expansion of the Abraham Accords. That's a crime against Israel. This is an historic opportunity. And instead, we're fighting street by street in Gaza City. That's not where the victory, again, it's not going to happen there. It'll happen in Tehran and in Riyadh. That's where the victory is going to happen. And Netanyahu would have once understood this. And so let's shift the emphasis after 2 years of war to the post-war period, at least in terms of the Abraham Accords.
You're talking, I'm thinking oddly about Martin Buber and how Ben Gurion used to gather moral voices, philosophers together, and they would debate decisions the government would make. And Buber was a thorn, I think, in Ben Gurion's side. And he would repeat to Ben Gurion over and over again in regards to the state of Israel, l'shem ma, l'shem ma, for what purpose is this state, right?
Yeah.
How does that speak to us today? What is the purpose? Is there a moral purpose, or are we a nation like all the other nations?
So here I'll channel my father, because what my father would say in response is, why do we have to be the only country in the world that has to justify its existence with a purpose? And if the only purpose of the Jewish state is to exist, to be a Jewish state, protecting the Jewish people and giving the Jewish people the space and the safety to work out whoever we want to be, whether we want to be a light to the nations or as dark as any other nation, Dayenu. That's good enough for speaking for my father. That's good enough for me. And I certainly am still sympathetic with that idea, which really shaped my childhood. That was my Jewish identity. It was all never again, and never again was for the Jews. It wasn't never again is now. Never again is for asylum seekers. Never again was for the Jewish people. And I'm still there. That's not to say that we shouldn't be caring about the suffering of other people, but the Holocaust belongs to us. That's our history. And just as an aside, if you look, I know I'm really going off on a tangent here, but I'm seething about this, is how since October 7th, the Holocaust has become a weapon against the Jewish people. And all of that Holocaust education, all of that effort that so many of us invested over the years in trying to get the world, trying to get American society, young people to understand, October 7th happens and we get it, and we just get it in the face. It's as if we gave young people a loaded gun and they and they and they and they and they used it as a firing squad against the Jewish people.
Well, I think that it's,
So,
I'm sorry.
so no, no, I'm. Oh, please go ahead.
No, I think just to build on what you're saying, in some ways, in the minds of many people around the world, Nakba and the Holocaust are equivalent,
Absolutely,
100%. And
and maybe Nakba is worse. Maybe Gaza is worse. And you
right,
know why? And you know why? Because you Jews who shoved the Holocaust down our throats, you should know better. And now you're doing the same thing, exactly the same thing, what was done to you. And we have to listen to those voices and ask ourselves a very hard question, which is, where did we go wrong? How did we fail to explain the uniqueness of the Holocaust, the uniqueness of anti-Semitism? How is it possible that so much of this generation that was raised on Holocaust education can turn around and see in Gaza the Holocaust? So that's an enormous failure, and I think it's the failure of the universalist approach to Holocaust education. We did not do a good enough job explaining how anti-Semitism works, why it's not conflated with racism. Racism is its own tragedy and its own dynamic that needs to be studied. Anti-Semitism works differently.
it's
and,
unique.
and we haven't taught that.
You
And
know,
so that's, I mean, but to get back to your question about,
no, go, I'm sorry, go.
no, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say, just one time, I would love to hear someone ask someone speaking about the Nakba what victory would have looked like in 1948. If Nakba is the catastrophe, what would victory have looked like? It would have been five armies, would have driven the Jews into the sea. There would be no state. Victory for
That's
us
the
would have
best.
meant that there would be
That's
another state living at our side.
Michael. That's the best framing that I've heard. The best rejoinder to this idea of Nakba. What was the catastrophe? And my friend, the late Saul Stern, who was a just a brilliant writer and journalist, wrote as one of his last pieces an analysis of how Nakba was understood in the Arab world in 1948. And it was understood not as the catastrophe of the Palestinians, but it was understood as the catastrophe, the military catastrophe of the Arab world's failure to destroy the Jewish state.
Yes.
That's what Nakba meant.
Hmm.
So
I just want to just touch back on the Prime Minister's speech and ask what the implications of that speech and the new front in Gaza City means to the hostages and their families.
The hostage families have been so mistreated by this government. It's one of the worst stories, one of the worst offenses of this government, and that's something that I don't think much of the diaspora is really aware of, the incitement against the families and treating them almost as a fifth column,
Hmm.
and not meeting with them for months on end. Uh, some of the families heard terrible news through the media and not from the government liaison. I mean, it goes on and on.
Right, but
And
couldn't
now we're looking at a situation where the hostage families are credibly accusing the government of not just not prioritizing the hostages, but of placing them in imminent mortal danger. And and it's interesting how the demonstrations over the hostages have played out in Israel and how they've played out in the diaspora. In the diaspora, the focus of your demonstrations necessarily is against Hamas, targeting the Red Cross and the UN. Here, the demonstrations are against our own government.
right, but don't we also have to factor in the fact that four-fifths of the hostages have been returned?
I'm not sure that has any um, relevance to the principle of Pidyon Shvuyim, of redeeming the captives. And I think for Netanyahu, that's the key. He said, "Look, I've already brought most of them back, and now we have to deliver victory."
Mm.
Now, I can, you know, it's an argument. It's an argument that we need to draw the line about how far we're going to go to allow ourselves to be blackmailed, because then there's no end to this. I think there's a good counter argument to be made that these people were betrayed by the government and the army. They were dragged out of their homes. These aren't soldiers who slipped up, when Gilad Shalit, the soldier that we traded 1,000 terrorists for, was taken into captivity. There were complicated circumstances there, and there was no negligence on the part of these hostages. They were betrayed. And I think we have a moral obligation to bring all of them home and then begin a national conversation about how do we do this differently next time,
Mm.
but not on their backs.
I mean, I want to shift to the high holidays. You wrote about it in your most recent article, and I just want to quote a little bit of what you said. The season of self-reckoning that begins with the Hebrew month of Elul and culminates on Yom Kippur is intended not only for individual Jews, but also, in fact, primarily for the Jewish collective. Undergoing this process as a people doesn't weaken us, it provides spiritual protection. Just as we need a language for defending ourselves against the lies and distortions, we need a parallel language in which we struggle with the moral dilemmas raised by this war. Those of us who love Israel must not forfeit the moral conversation to Jews who have despaired of Israel or who openly side with our enemies. Simultaneously, defending and critiquing ourselves requires two very different tones. In confronting the anti-Zionist mob, we must respond with outrage and contempt, but our internal conversation requires humility. And I want to stay on the Seifa, the second part of that conversation, and talk a little bit about the conversation between Israelis and American Jews or Jews in the diaspora, and ask you, are there limits on the conversation between these two groups who do not send their children to the army or pay taxes in Israel?
Answer rationally or ideologically and emotionally. Emotionally, of course. When my son was at war in Gaza and there was criticism from the diaspora, I hated it. Hated it. I do have to say that there are gradations of criticism. I think it's legitimate and necessary for diaspora Jews to raise questions about how the war is being conducted. When we start hearing Jews adopt the language of genocide, then I'm out. There's no, I'm not a partner for that kind of conversation. Ideologically, if we are serious about Israel as the center of the Jewish people, and I think that that's true both practically speaking, Israel is the largest Jewish community in the world, and we are, in fact, the spiritual center, in many ways, the cultural center, uh, but also ideologically. I believe that there is no Jewish people without its center point of Zion.
Mhm.
Then I have a responsibility to open up the conversation on Israel to anyone who in the Jewish people. It's 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 part of being a citizen of the Jewish people to take responsibility for Israel. And after October 7th, we also know that what we decide here can impact very directly on your lives, even physically.
Very much so.
And you know, I always felt that the diaspora not only has the right but the responsibility to speak out on issues like who is a Jew, which directly impacts on a majority of the diaspora. During the judicial coup, the year leading up to October 7th, I felt very strongly and took a public stand on this that diaspora Jews should join with the pro-democracy movement in Israel and make sure that Israel remains a democracy. And it was very practical for me. How can diaspora Jews continue to show the Israeli flag in your synagogues if, God forbid, we become a Jewish version of Hungary? I think it'll be increasingly difficult. And so so those issues always seem to me to be obvious.
Yeah.
In terms of security, I have to own it. You know, if I believe that we're really all in this together, then yes, diaspora Jews have the right and the responsibility to speak even about these issues. I would only hope that that there would be some measure of humility. And look, I feel when I wrote that article raising moral questions about this war, it was the first time I've done this in this war. Uh, it was very difficult. And it actually took me weeks to write. And I did not want to write that article. And one of the reasons was I'm not there. I'm not there. All right, our kids are there, but I'm not there.
Mhm.
And I don't really understand what our kids are up against. And that kind of hesitation is something that I think all of us who are not there should feel.
Mm.
That's not a veto on raising questions or having strong opinions,
No,
but it should be a factor in the mix.
I couldn't agree more. In our remaining minutes, I want to do a high holiday lightning round with you, although I hesitate to use the term lightning round about anything on Yom Kippur, but the people are going to be leaving this conversation, going to Mincha and then Ni'ilah. So let me ask you this. Before the Sharei Tefillah close during Ni'ilah, What is your prayer for Israel in this moment?
That we relearn the wisdom of balance. And balance means, first of all, in relation to the war, what we were talking about earlier, that we struggle to maintain some balance between security needs and morality. And what worries me desperately about the Israel diaspora relationship, specifically the American Jewish Israeli relationship, is that we're losing the balance. Israel is becoming increasingly focused only on the security question, and large parts of American Jewry are becoming increasingly focused only on the moral questions, so that we as a people hold on to balance. But balance takes us into all kinds of directions. There's an internal balance in how we hold the ideological um, opposition within the Jewish people, between those parts of the Jewish people that lean more toward a universal understanding of Judaism, those that lean more toward a particularist understanding of Judaism, that we as a people regain the wisdom of maintaining a creative tension between our contradictions.
I love that. A creative tension between our contradictions. Second question. What is the tshuva, tefillah, and staka this year, this Yom Kippur, that ma'avirin et roa gzera, that will avert a terrible decree?
Something that my partner, my colleague and friend, Rabbi Daniel Hartman, says, and we were partners in a weekly podcast, for heaven's sake, and we work out these issues live. And Daniel likes to say that for many Jews, the uh, notion of tshuva, of penitence, of the al chet, is you bang on the next Jew's chest. You have to repent for everything you did wrong. And that's kind of the nature of our arguments through most of the year. And that's probably unavoidable because that's what arguments really are about. Um, at this time, I think each community of Jews should look at itself, say, how can we create a more functional Jewish people? Because we're heading, God forbid, toward becoming a post people that whose elements don't even have the most basic shared language. So what can we do to start listening to each other's concerns and hold the Jewish people together?
So that I just want to clarify that idea of post people. We are post Zionists and post American Jews. How did you understand that?
Well, a people recognizes that it is a messy construct. The difference between a community and a people is that a community strives for harmony and relative homogeneity. I mean, I'm sure, in your synagogue you have political differences, but there is a striving, at least religiously, we're kind of on the same page, and that's a community, that's a synagogue. And so you'll have breakaways, right? Because this synagogue is becoming too diverse for me, or too. I need to daven with people who look like me and share similar concerns. That's a community, and a people, a people is a dysfunctional synagogue. That's a people,
Yeah.
and and so that's when I say that we're in danger of becoming a post people. I mean that we're seemingly heading toward a situation where we're not we don't even share the most minimal language. Now I remember, and I imagine we're more or less the same generation.
Yes.
Uh, May 1967, Yom Kippur 1973, and it might be worth speaking for a moment about Yom Kippur 1973, because those were moments when we really came together. October 8th, 2023, when the whole people of Israel and most of the diaspora, almost the entirety of the diaspora, came together. It was an extraordinary moment. And that's what I'm desperate for us to hold on to in some way.
Yeah. Halevi, I certainly remember that moment. My bar mitzvah was June 24th, 1967.
Oh,
It
wow.
was very
Wow.
much the focus of that time. Yossi Klein, Halevi, what an honor, what a privilege, what a gift to spend time with you. Um, on a personal level, it's really very, very meaningful for me, and I know for our entire congregation. So toda rabah.
Well, Michael, thank you for the honor of this conversation at this time for you in your life. And I want to thank you for your friendship over the years. And I was just remembering when we first met. We met in your home at an APAC event about Iran.
Yeah,
So you and I have been at this for
a long
a
time.
long time. And thank you for everything you've done and will do for the Jewish people, for making us stronger, for making us a better people. And thank you for your leadership and wishing you in this coming year of transition, personal transition for you, blessings and strength.
Gemar Chatima Tova.
K'mar Chatima Tova.